Hello everybody, my name is Ryan Luhrs and I'm an Associate Professor of Music in Lenore Ryan's music program, where I work primarily with our choral ensembles and also teach and mentor future music educators and future sacred musicians. From time to time I also teach a course in our university's core curriculum called Music and Protest. I'm honored to be with you this week for this fascinating and very pertinent course. I've enjoyed hearing from my colleagues in previous weeks and learning from their expertise, and it's my hope that I too can contribute something of an additional useful perspective as we talk about race and racism, and this week doing so through the lens of the arts, specifically music, and even more specifically through singing and choral music and music education. I'm going to start with a little bit about my background, both as an introduction to me and also to give you some insight on how I come to this conversation and into this topic. So I'm both an educator, a music educator, and a sacred musician. And as a music educator and someone who now prepares future music educators, it's really important in our field that we are talking about and putting into practice cultural sensitivity as we sing the music of a variety of cultures, as we try to select music and teach music in a way that is representative of the people who are in front of us, but also using music and music education as a door or portal to cultures that are different than our own. Music is often a very effective way to have a meaningful interaction with a culture that's different than one's own. And then as a church musician, I've been drawn to music making in this context where there isn't rehearsing for a congregation to sing. It's people showing up and singing together. And often this is music making that in worship setting, it's both praise to God, but it's also about identity and social connection. And that is something that I've been drawn to, how music functions as a catalyst for social cohesion or togetherness, identity, a sense of we. And that kind of music making goes on in a variety of contexts, including athletic events. I especially think of European soccer matches where the crowd is often singing together the whole time as a way of supporting their team. Also in protest, people will often sing together and chant together as a way of furthering and advancing their cause. And then in times of tragedy, there are often vigils and community gatherings, and those are also times in which you will often see people singing together. They're often experiencing feelings of fear or uncertainty or loneliness, and the act of singing together is something that can help the sense of bonding or togetherness. So wherever I've lived in my professional career, I've explored how music can function, where you're trying to bring together a variety of people from diverse backgrounds. When I lived in central Minnesota, that was as simple as bringing together different Lutherans. Not all Lutherans get along, and I thought, well, maybe their shared musical heritage could help us develop better relationships. I've also worked in settings where there are Lutherans and Catholics together. Again, not very racially diverse in that setting, but nonetheless, getting people together around song who have a different background of some kind. Then when I moved to Tallahassee, Florida for my PhD work, it's a much more racially diverse city than where I had lived before. And that was an opportunity to explore how music functioned in a setting where there were salient racial groups singing together. It eventually grew into a scholarly interest that led to a dissertation and is an ongoing source of inspiration for scholarly interest in continuing to explore how music functions, where the primary goal might not be a recording or a performance, but developing a sense of we and perhaps reducing prejudice between different groups. Before I go any farther, I would like to outline what you're about to experience in these presentations and what my goal is for you, or the objectives of this week. First, I'm going to define some key terms in just a few minutes, and then the rest of this presentation is going to be exploring Black spirituals as protest music and also as a form of art that really is foundational The last slide on this presentation is that of a tree, and African American spirituals were really a foundation for lots of art and lots of, especially music, and it was inspirational to the formation of a lot of uniquely American musical genres. And in the second presentation, we're going to dive into history of music education, and especially emphasize how music outside the Western European tradition was talked about and included and often excluded from the music curriculum in this nation's history. But let's begin by defining a few key terms. Representation, in the most basic sense, is seeing yourself represented in leadership or in what's accepted as being normal. Another way to think about representation could be through the lens of lack of representation. So underrepresented populations are less likely to see representatives for their group in leadership positions, such as teachers, board members, presidents, professors. In our field, we're less likely to see, for underrepresented, we're probably less likely to see music conductors. And in the artistic world, especially in what we might call high art, the work of underrepresented populations is often absent or tokenized or seen as other, periphery, not as legitimate as the established norm, which in our case, in this country, the established norm is often defined by white Western European cultural norms and values. So representation is seeing yourself in leadership and in authority. And in the picture, it's having a place at the table. In a board, it would be literally having a place. If you have representation at the board level of your organization, but figuratively as well. If the board table represents authority and something that's important, it's having a place and having a voice at that table. So that's representation. Appropriation, there is a little bit more of a clear definition in our dictionaries. Merriam-Webster says that appropriation is to take or make use without authority or right. And then Oxford says appropriation is the action of taking something for one's own use, typically without the owner's permission. In the context of cultural appropriation, providing some examples for you down below. Perhaps there isn't a day that is more, or a day where there is more cultural appropriation going on than Halloween, where if you're a member of the dominant culture and you are trying to present yourself as a member of a marginalized community, you're probably engaging in cultural appropriation, benefiting either through laughs or just having a good time in Halloween by presenting yourself as a member of another culture. Next to that person at the left, we see the Cleveland Indians mascot, an example again of cultural appropriation, where money has been made. This is a brand. This is a logo, and it's a caricature of an indigenous population in this country, both in terms of its color and how it's presented. And lots of people, and probably lots of people of European descent, have benefited financially from the use of that picture, of that logo. In the middle, we have an example of somebody donning blackface. Blackface minstrelsy was the dominant form of entertainment, the most popular form of entertainment in this country in the late 19th century and on into the 20th century, where individuals would cover their face with grease, cork grease, and appear as white, so taking, without the authority or right to do so, taking the appearance of a black person and exaggerating stereotypes both visually and in how they acted, and presented skits and comedy, often poking fun of African American culture, again for the sake of laughter and for financial gain, often financial gain by someone of the dominant culture, or someone who was white. In the picture all the way to the right is the Florida State University, probably at a football game, and people doing the famous tomahawk chop. The Florida State mascot is the Seminole, and therefore Florida State football fans, if you are an opponent, you will be greeted by fans doing the tomahawk chop, again insinuating the use of a hatchet to slay one's opponent, and that is a gesture that is associated with with that university in that setting. So that's cultural appropriation. Tokenism is the practice of making only a symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from an underrepresented group in order to give the appearance of equality. That's what Oxford says. Merriam-Webster says it's the policy or practice of making only a symbolic effort. The picture down below would be an example of this. If this is an organization that doesn't have much cultural diversity or racial or ethnic diversity, it's putting a person of color at the center of the photo as if to give the impression that it is actually culturally diverse, racially diverse. So that would be tokenism. Right, so the remainder of this presentation is going to be talking about spirituals. And African American spirituals were born out of enslaved Africans and their experience. Without slavery, we probably don't have spirituals in this country. And this form of art, as I mentioned earlier, became the basis for many of the musical genres that we call American. And we'll list some of those a little bit later. But enslaved Africans had very little they could do in response to being taken from the African continent and brought over to the North American continent. Ways they could protest. They could take their own life or the life of their child while on the slave ships. If your only purpose in life was to be an economic resource and you were aware of that, you could end that by taking your life. Another form of protest was becoming educated or learning to read in secret. Most slaveholders would discourage that or make it impossible, make it very difficult to get your hands on literature and books, because an educated slave in their mind would be a dangerous slave, because they could more likely to lead a revolt and have the means to create all sorts of trouble. Speaking of revolting or escaping, that was another form of protest, and that brought with it a heavy cost. If you got caught, both for yourself, you could lose your own life, and the lives of your family could also be endangered, or there could be punishment. So it was a very risky thing to engage in. Some were successful, most were not when they tried to escape. A slave could also pray for divine deliverance. And finally, a slave could also sing. And we're going to focus on that one. So why singing? And we can look at this, we can back out from the context of slavery now and talk about singing in general. I'm not sure if I can claim that this would be universal, about everybody in all cultures thinking about singing this way, but it seems like this transcends a lot of cultures and how we approach singing. First of all, with singing, you don't need anything. You don't need an instrument. You can just sing. All you need is your human body to engage in this activity. Singing can help pass the time, which is probably valuable for someone who is engaged in brutal work throughout the day, probably very tedious work throughout the day. Singing would also helps us connect to previous generations. Especially important if that ancestry is important and valued by your culture. You can think about how songs that you sing might have been sung by your parents, that were sung by their parents, sung by their parents. There's a connection through the generations through song. Singing can also help tell stories and preserve a history, especially important in cultures where oral transmission of history is important. In general, singing is considered a pleasing activity. Research has shown that people who sing enjoy doing so and are in a better mood after doing it. Singing with other people produces oxytocin, which is known as the bonding hormone. So there's research that suggests after engaging in singing with a group of people, you feel more connected with them just because of the mere act of singing with them. Singing also creates vibrations with the body. Literally, singing and all music is vibrations. Sound is vibration. And in the body, It causes your body to vibrate, and it's much perhaps like a massage. In some way, it can be relaxing. Just the act of humming can be soothing and relaxing. And if you hold a baby, one of the thoughts of why babies might fall asleep because you're singing or singing a lullaby is because of the vibration that they feel and the soothing sensations that are conveyed through the vibration while you sing. Then singing is also a healthy way to engage with many feelings, whether it's joy, or sadness, or frustration, or loneliness. If there is an emotion or a feeling, there is a way probably to sing about it. And doing so, engaging through singing is a way that's probably not going to be damaging. And there are other ways, as we know, to numb feelings that are probably not as helpful. And it can be damaging to the body. So singing is a healthy way to engage with those feelings. Then finally, singing in all art lends itself to multiple layers of meaning, which can be helpful if you're trying to protest, especially helpful if you're trying to protest in sight of people that you are protesting against. So how would spirituals accomplish this? Well, now back to the context specifically of enslaved Africans. Well, there are multiple layers of meaning in almost every spiritual, and those multiple layers are sometimes called double-voicedness, or signifying, shadow language, or codes. So the first example of a spiritual, and I encourage you to listen to the recordings I provide for you. I'm just going to speak them right now. I'm not going to sing them. The first example is, "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." So that is simply a story from Exodus, the story of the Hebrew slaves being liberated by Moses, and God's mighty acts of deliverance are a part of that story. So this spiritual was associated originally with Harriet Tubman. She was often referred to as Moses for this very reason, that she would go down into the South and help slaves escape. So the words that appear in red are the double-voicedness, or the multiple layer of meaning. And telling old Pharaoh to let my people go could be interpreted as tell the slaveholders to let the slaves go. So the belief was, in singing this, in these stories from the Hebrew Bible, God had acted mightily and miraculously in the past, and those who believed in God could be assured that God's mighty hand would also deliver them from their current condition of being enslaved. And the belief that in God, it's God, not the slave, who is saying, let my people go, which is saying that emancipation from slavery is in fact God ordained. It's not just the slave that wants to be freed. In fact, it's God's very will that the slave be emancipated. So go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. The words of God, based on how they were being sung by the slaves. And interestingly enough, contemporary Jews now sing this spiritual, which was a gift from enslaved Africans who were inspired by the heritage and the stories of ancient Israelites. So it's come full circle, in a sense, from groups who have been marginalized in this world. Another example of a spiritual is Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel? Also drawing on stories from the Hebrew Bible. The text is, Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Deliver Daniel. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Then why not every man? He delivered Daniel from the lion's den, Jonah from the belly of the whale, and the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace. Then why not every man? The same idea here that was at work in Go Down Moses, where God has acted to deliver the underdog, if you will, or the person who had been marginalized in some way. Stories throughout the Bible of this taking place. That means God will also ordain the emancipation of the slave. And the why not every man, I mean, that seems like it's a pretty overt statement of protest. If God's done this over here for all these people, why not me? It's a rhetorical question for the singer. So hundreds, if not thousands, of spirituals were being sung. They're a form of folk music. They weren't really written down as they were being sung. Of course, this is a time where we didn't have recordings. But they were preserved up until the present by a variety of methods. And I should point out before mentioning those that there were also folks who did not want to sing spirituals after the emancipation, because they associated that type of singing and that type of music with trauma and did not want to re-experience that trauma that was linked to music. But there were African American churches that continued to sing spirituals. As I mentioned, blackface minstrelsy was very popular in the period after the Civil War, and in the context of making fun of black culture and making a mockery of African Americans, a lot of the actors would sing spirituals. So while it wasn't presented in a very culturally sensitive way, it nonetheless helped preserve the spirituals because they were still being sung. In the picture you see the Fisk Jubilee Singers. It's the first touring collegiate ensemble, and they program spirituals as part of their concert presentations. Barbershop singing emerged from the African American community post-Civil War, and they also sang spiritual arrangements in that setting. Songsters, people who would sing on the streets, sang spirituals. Prominent choral music arrangers took the spirituals as they were sung, which were not arranged in any formal way, and then they arranged them and wrote them down in ways that a choir could rehearse and learn them and present them in a concert. Prominent recording artists such as Mahalia Jackson and Paul Robeson recorded spirituals, which helped preserve them to the present. And then finally they were included in the 1960s civil rights movement. Some words sometimes have been changed for the context of that civil rights movement. Some were sung exactly the way they were during the time of slavery. So with spirituals and those who sang them, this continent was introduced to new sounds. Soon, sounds that became foundational, or the roots of an American music soundscape and family tree. So some examples of those characteristics would be singing that was what we might call soulful or from the heart, really coming from a place deep within that communicated deep pain or grief, loneliness, and struggle in a way that this continent probably hadn't heard before. There's also great rhythmic complexity and syncopation in this music. Even in "Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel," has a degree of syncopation, almost dance-like rhythms that makes you want to tap your foot or nod your head or at least move around a little bit. There was more rhythmic complexity and more syncopation in music emerging from Europe at the same time. There was also quite a bit of ornamentation and bending and sliding into pitches that we can link to this period of time and this style of music. So I could sing Amazing Grace very straight. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, without much ornamentation. I could sing it, I'll try to do some ornamentation, and I could sing it another way, something like this. Amazing grace, oh, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I'm sliding into some of the pitches. I am adding notes that aren't on the page. It's not a style of music I often sing, but hopefully that was a demonstration where you can kind of get the idea. It is most likely, we believe that it's inspired by some of the music that was being sung by enslaved Africans, and is now carried through into the present, where a lot of, especially pop artists, will engage in that type of ornamentation and singing. There's also a new harmonic vocabulary that was brought to this continent. A lot of music coming from Europe relied on the major scale or Ionian mode. Sounds like this. Very common to Western European trained ears, and was the basis for a lot of music that was around at the time. Now we can think of the blues scale, which sounds like that. And we don't have the blues scale on this continent without it being introduced by people from Africa. So while it probably wasn't written down anywhere what a blues scale was at the time, there is definitely blue notes that are being sung and are evident in these spirituals. So what are blue notes? So the major scale sounds like this. There are no blues notes in a major scale. But this note, the notes that I'm lingering on and emphasizing, could be considered blues notes. Of course, that type of harmonic vocabulary became the foundation for blues music, which has its roots in spirituals and blues music and jazz, all the way on up to R&B and pop music of today. That type of harmonic vocabulary is present. The final characteristic is the presence of music being sung by an individual using first-person language, such as "I've been buked" and "I've been scorned." And even though it's first person, even though it's a soloist singing, the whole community feels like they're a part of that story because of the words and because of the shared experience that's understood as they're singing. So in conclusion, spirituals were the foundational roots for many uniquely American music styles and a family tree of genres that were to come, including jazz and blues, R&B, doo-wop, soul, funk, rock, disco, rap, and hip-hop. In fact, much of the music being listened to today in this country can trace its origins back in its musical family tree down to the roots of spirituals. So next I'd like you to view two recordings of the spirituals that I mentioned in this lecture, both Did It My Lord Deliver Daniel and Go Down Moses, being sung by the Moses Hogan Chorale and Paul Robeson, respectively. And then I'll have you come back and we'll talk about music education and how that relates to race and racism in this country.